This video is a response to a video by a progressive channel called Three Arrows on what he refers to as the myth of cultural Marxism. Let's take a look.
Hey guys, today's video is gonna be a bit different, because it's partially gonna be a game show. But the main focus lies on showing the connection between the extremely anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of cultural Bolshevism, propagated by the extreme right in Weimar Germany, and the cultural Marxism theory you often hear today. And yes, there is a connection, although the right and certain YouTube skeptics like to pretend it doesn't exist. So what is cultural Marxism? Well, everyone seems to have a different definition on this, but the general consensus seems to be that there is a certain group of people, namely Marxists, who try to influence Western culture in a certain way to ultimately bring down Western civilization, which they view as oppressive. Their tools to reach this goal are things like feminism, multiculturalism, diversity quotas, or through arts or social sciences. The explanation of what cultural Marxism actually is heavily depends on who you ask.
Here I disagree. I generally don't use the phrase cultural Marxism, but I would refer to it more as a belief rather than a conspiracy theory. I usually use the phrase progressivism, which is the idea that the blank slate is true and that people are interchangeable. This is why, according to progressives, disparity between people on the basis of gender, nationality, race, culture, or whatever such factors is illegitimate and must be the result of one demographic oppressing another because they believe all else is equal. I'd say that things like multiculturalism and feminism are the results of this belief system, not necessarily tools being used by Marxists in order to advance it. This is what people generally refer to when they say cultural Marxism. It's the idea of applying the oppressor versus the oppressed narrative to culture rather than class, as in traditional Marxism. It doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in a conspiracy theory.
Jordan Peterson, for instance, usually uses the term postmodernism and traces this movement back to French intellectuals like Jacques Derrida, but the theory is basically the same. However, the vast majority of people who buy into this theory refer to something called the Frankfurt School as the origin of this subversive movement. Here a bunch of Marxists got together to think of a way to turn a capitalist society into a communist one through different means than calling for the uprising of the proletariat, since this wasn't just appealing to the masses after the disaster of Stalinism. What they came up with was cultural Marxism, or sometimes called critical theory.
I can only speak for myself, but I certainly don't believe that the French postmodernists or the Frankfurt School were all sitting in a room coming up with ways that they can destroy Western civilization in this dubious plot to instill communism. But it's clear that their work was heavily influential towards far-left academics. Critical theory is constantly employed throughout academia today. For example, Duke University has a center for critical theory. Critical theory is the critique of aspects of society and culture. It aims to deconstruct the forces in society that enslave people. Why do you think you hear the word deconstruct so often in universities these days? Deconstruct white privilege, deconstruct colonialism, or the patriarchy, or heteronormativity. You get the idea. I don't think that the Frankfurt School came up with these ideas as their secret weapon to destroy the West, and I don't think it was them and them alone who are pushing these ideas, but their work certainly had influence.
Now you might be wondering, what do the Nazis have to do with this? People like Sargon or Stefan Molyneux never attribute this supposed movement to Jews or say anything which could be laid out as anti-Semitic. Well, all in due time. Let's take a look at history first. Here's where you'll be able to score your first point. You will hear a quote, and if you can vaguely guess who might have said it, you score a point. Let's listen in.
Bolshevism is not only anti-bourgeois, it is anti-cultural. It means, in the final consequence, the absolute destruction of all economic, social, state, cultural, and civilizing advances made by Western civilization for the benefit of a ruthless and nomadic international clique of conspirators who have found their representation in Jewry.
Now the end kinda gave it away there, but that's okay. If you guess this quote is probably from some Nazi, you're correct. It is taken from one of Joseph Goebbels' speeches in 1935. Starting in the Weimar Republic and up until 1945, the far right used the term cultural Bolshevism to demonstrate how the Bolsheviks tried to subvert German society with progressive art, lifestyle, and things like Bauhaus architecture, to eventually take over completely, while simultaneously destroying the appreciation of non-degenerate art. The Nazis viewed Bolshevism or Marxism as inherently Jewish, by the way. And like cultural Marxism today, the Nazis always kept it really vague and difficult to pin down who was actually doing this supposed subversion of Western civilization and how.
Alright, here's a fallacy. Let's say I said the Earth is round. I'd be correct. Then let's say I said the earth is round and the sun revolves around it. I'd be incorrect. But not about the earth being round, I'd be incorrect about the sun revolving around it. The first statement is still true. While it is true that Jews were highly represented in some of these Marxist movements, I don't believe that there's this international conspiracy of Jews who can control everything and are using Bolshevism as their tool to destroy the West. Having said that, the first part of the statement is valid. Bolshevism does destroy culture. After the Russian Revolution, Orthodox churches were demolished, Orthodox priests were murdered, and the rich art of Imperial Russia was replaced with hideous socialist realism. In China, likewise, during the Cultural Revolution, monasteries were demolished, intellectuals killed, and relics were destroyed. It might not have been the JQ behind it, but saying that Marxism destroyed culture in the 20th century is a completely valid statement. And I'd argue that it would be accurate to say that progressive art and architecture today does the same thing. Why do you think cities like Paris, Prague, or St. Petersburg are such popular tourist destinations? It's because of the beautiful classical architecture. Do you really think as many people would want to visit Prague if it looked like this? Call me an art snob, but I do feel that culture is being lost when today you're more likely to see something like this in an art gallery than you are to see something like this.
Now, just because they sound very similar, that doesn't mean there's necessarily a link between the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the Nazis and the theory of cultural Marxism today. But by the end of this video, you will see where I'm coming from. For now, we'll put German history to the side for a second. Let's look at the two guys who did the biggest job in spreading the idea of cultural Marxism subverting Western civilization through academia. And here you can earn your next point. I will give you a book title and you can guess who wrote it. Here it goes. The Death of the West, How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization. If you guessed Stefan Molyneux, that would be understandable since it sounds very much like the secondary title of his book, but it's actually from Pat Buchanan, who is your typical borderline racist paleo-conservative who likes to complain about Jews being overrepresented in the US Supreme Court. In his book that I just mentioned, he claims that cultural Marxists subvert and de-Christianize Western civilization through academia and also points to the Frankfurt School. And by de-Christianize, he doesn't mean people are less likely to love their neighbor, but become more accepting towards homosexuality and stuff like that.
Things like mass immigration and low birth rates do cause culture to die because they prevent culture from being passed on. For example, in Britain, the capital city, London, England, its white British population was surveyed at less than 45%, and that was in 2011. Do you think that London is now more British or less? Do you think there's a stronger British identity there or a weaker one? And yes, the policies that allow for this to happen are heavily pushed in academia and the media. As for the West being less Christian, Christianity has a large set of values and ethics. Adhering to it is a lifestyle. It's not simply love your neighbor. It is something that modern academia is very much against. Do you really think the Gender Studies Department has a very high opinion on the teachings of the Catholic Church?
He also wrote a book on how Britain should have never declared war on Nazi Germany and that the Holocaust was more or less a consequence of that. Now my summary was very simplified, but Christopher Hitchens wrote a good critique of it, which I will leave in the description. And like the Jews in Weimar Germany, the Frankfurt School provides a convenient target for people like Buchanan. By centering the conspiracy around Marxism, since there are no Bolsheviks around anymore, they want to evoke the feeling that Western culture is being attacked from the outside by a mysterious anti-American cabal that nobody can really pin down, but has its fingers in everything.
When people on the right say cultural Marxism or progressivism or whatever you want to call it, they aren't referring to an outside source. It really just means the mindset of the intelligentsia of Western countries. The media, academia, entertainment, and also by extension the government force a very anti-Western narrative. Don't believe me? Well, why does Viacom, a multi-billion-dollar company which owns MTV, produce shows like Francesca Ramsey's Decoded? What about BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, Vice? These all have net worths of hundreds of millions of dollars, and in some cases billions of dollars. Or just watch a Justin Trudeau speech. See how many times he apologizes for the past and raves about how amazing multiculturalism is.
The other guy is William S. Lind, who is a bit more overt about his views than Pat Buchanan. For instance, he consistently speaks out for bringing back hanging as a common sentence for crime, but only in what he describes as urban areas. In 1989, he spoke at a conference and claimed that political correctness and cultural Marxism were totalitarian ideologies that were turning American campuses into small, ivy-covered North Koreas, where the student or faculty member who dares to cross any of the lines set up by the gender feminists or the homosexual rights activists will quickly find themselves in legal trouble. And this was in 1989, so as you can see, this is not a new talking point by the right. And here is where we get to the good stuff. Like so many of the YouTube skeptics or Jordan Peterson, Lin cultivated a certain group of people with his comments.
Could Jewish individuals use their position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews?
Hold it.
In 2002, he attended a conference in Washington, D.C. He held a speech at this conference, which was put up by the bi-monthly Holocaust denier magazine Barnes Review, in front of a bunch of self-described historical revisionists, anti-Semites and neo-Nazis. And while I should mention that Lind is not a Holocaust denier, in his speech he identified a small group of people who had poisoned American culture and pointed to a specific connection. These guys, meaning those guys over at the Frankfurt School, they were all Jewish, which was of course met with thundering applause by his audience.
You keep using this fallacy where you say, this guy said this, and he's anti-Semitic, therefore he's wrong. The far left does have ideological hegemony over college campuses. It doesn't matter if the people that said that were anti-Semitic or not, it's still true. There was a TA, for example, at University of Laurier that was disciplined for just showing a clip of Jordan Peterson speaking, in a neutral light. She was interrogated by several faculty members for only presenting differing arguments. If you want more batshit insane stories from universities, go to Campus Reform or Professor Watch List. And while I certainly don't believe that the Frankfurt School was part of some mass Jewish conspiracy, saying most of them were Jewish still is factually correct, even if it was said with malicious intent.
Now, up until this point, I only talked about where this theory originated and how it entered the modern discourse. What about the Frankfurt School? Let's take a look. I can't go into much detail here because philosophy is not my strong side, but even as a layman, reading up on the Frankfurt School and the work of the theorists there, it becomes blatantly obvious that it doesn't fit the narrative of the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Let's listen to another quote and try to guess who might have said it.
Culture today is infecting everything with sameness. Film, radio, and magazines form a system. Each branch of culture is unanimous within itself, and all are unanimous together. Film and radio no longer need to present themselves as art.
Now that sounded awfully similar to Paul Joseph Watson's criticism of modern entertainment.
Look at popular music. The same handful of people writing and producing songs for the same handful of popular artists. Why do you think everything sounds the same? The same procession of electronic beats, repeated hooks, and verbal diarrhea that passes for popular music now.
He is not the one who wrote this, though. It was actually Theodor Adorno who is credited as the main proponent of critical theory and the Frankfurt School. But while Paul attributes him and his colleagues with the phasing of popular culture, the Frankfurt School criticizes the exact same thing in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, under the chapter The Culture Industry. Only that Adorno believes capitalism is at fault for this. And you know, maybe he has a point there. What is more likely to be the reason for this? Is it maybe that sex sells and gets attention? Or is it the plan of Adorno and Horkheimer, who would have despised this, to secretly utter in a new era of communism? I'll let you decide.
I actually somewhat agree with this part. I do feel that mindless pop culture is the result of consumerism, which is fed by neoliberal economic policy, not by Marxism. I will say, though, that I highly doubt whatever Adorno had in mind as an alternative would have been any better. I feel that the decline in art is due to materialism, which is a mindset held both in consumer culture and by Marxists. And as I've shown before, Marxist art is horrible.
Okay, we're getting close to the end here, so I only have 2 questions left. I'm looking for a philosopher who strongly criticized postmodernism because he thought that people like Derrida, Foucault, and Nietzsche committed a contradiction in their critiques of postmodernism by employing concepts and methods that only modern reason can provide. He also criticized Nietzsche's methods as a gesture towards the loss of unity in Western culture that was provided by religion in pre-modern times. If you guessed it was the savior of Western civilization himself, Jordan Peterson, you would be wrong. I was talking about a guy called Jürgen Habermas, who took over as the main representative of the Frankfurt School after Adorno died, and who is one of the most prominent critics of postmodernism. So prominent, in fact, that he has his own entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, some of you might be asking yourself, a Marxist criticizing postmodernism? How does that go together, since Peterson always mentions those postmodern neo-Marxists? Well, this really shows the big problem when people talk about these things on YouTube. They use certain words so interchangeably without explaining what they are actually talking about until these words have lost all their meaning. Marxism is the same thing as communism, which is the same thing as postmodernism and Stalinism, etc., etc. They should just call them the bad guys from now on, seriously.
This part I actually somewhat agree with. It's true that postmodernism and Marxism are not the same thing. Postmodernism is a rejection of meta-narratives, whereas Marxism is a narrative itself on class relations. So yes, they should not be used interchangeably, but both schools of thought encompass deconstruction. Again, I don't believe in a conspiracy theory, but I would say that academia has pushed far-left ideas into the mainstream, and postmodernism and Marxism both had a hand in it. Just not all far-left academics think the same way.
What I'm getting at is that this boogeyman that the Cultural Marxism meme is trying to sell you as the Frankfurt School is not at all based in reality. While people like Adorno, Horkheimer, Löwenthal and Neumann were Marxists, they were hardly hell-bent on destroying Western values or civilization. In fact, they wanted to hold on and promote these values like rationalism and personal freedom. What they critiqued was the way that capitalism was detrimental to Enlightenment values and culture. And if you take a dive into their actual work, you will find that some of these guys actually dislike things like postmodernism, pop culture or political correctness.
Here's a criticism I have, and I also direct this towards many skeptics or classical liberals. What do they mean when they say Western civilization? Because I keep hearing people say Enlightenment values and freedom or rationalism are Western values, and I completely disagree. To me, Western civilization is made up of things like nations, peoples, cultures, histories, religion. It's a way of life. The West is not a monolith, and it's certainly not just some vague set of ideas like freedom or rationalism. There's no way the Marxists at the Frankfurt School were standing up for Western civilization. Marxism itself was a critique of Western civilization. It seeks to deconstruct its way of life, certainly not preserve it.
The notion that these guys wanted to bring about communism with the means of political correctness is even contradictory to Marx's understanding, that this goal can only be reached by changes in economic relationships between people. But I'm sure if there's anyone in the comment section with a background in philosophy, he or she can explain it much better than I can. You know, there's a reason Wikipedia had to remove the entry for Cultural Marxism and move it to the entry of the Frankfurt School as a conspiracy theory. And it's not the international Jewish cabal. It is because not a single person could provide evidence for it or show a link between the people in the feminist cringe compilations and some guys in Germany writing about how much they hate shitty boy bands. Ultimately, this theory is defeated by one question. Where is the evidence?
It's pretty simple. Again, there wasn't a conspiracy, but the Frankfurt School was very influential on leftist academics. It wasn't only them, but they played a large part in it. In a 2007 study, 17.6% of American social science professors self-identified as Marxists. For sociology, it was 25.5%. And this is just the ones that admit it. It's safe to say that most of these professors probably have read the work from the Frankfurt School, and the people that become SJWs, more often than not, have exposure to this in their education. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out.
You know, where is it? Where are these Marxist countries in the West? In the birth country of Marx, the two biggest communist parties, which are the German Communist Party and the Marxist-Leninist Party, didn't even get more than 0.1% of the votes combined. You know, Trump is president and Brexit happened and all of Europe is shifting to the right.
I wonder why.
But since I saw some college students waving a USSR flag on YouTube, this really is the biggest threat to Western values, I guess. I'm obviously not a communist, so if there's a takeover ahead, I want to know, but no one can provide me any evidence. Not even Miley Cyrus coming out and saying that she really opened her eyes to bring down Western culture via dancing naked on stage. And if you ask people who subscribe to the Cultural Marxism meme for evidence, they'll usually point to political correctness or radical students. Well, maybe it's not the international Marxist cabal who is secretly pulling the strings, but other factors.
Remember earlier in the video when you said that terms like Marxism and communism shouldn't be used interchangeably? I think you're guilty of that here. Marxism is a lens to look at the world through focused on class struggle. It sees the bourgeoisie as the oppressor and the proletariat as the oppressed. Marxist-Leninism or communism is a political ideology aimed at putting Marxism into practice. It involves abolishment of class, dictatorship of the proletariat, and common ownership of the means of production. In practice, Marxist-Leninism actually was a one-party dictatorship with a state-planned economy. When someone says cultural Marxism, they are referring to the oppressor versus oppressed narrative being applied to things like race, gender, or culture, rather than economic class. For example, when asked why men take up the leadership roles of society, feminists would say it's because men oppressed women, rather than saying it's because there's a fundamental difference between the genders. Or when asked why the West was the most powerful civilization, they would say it's because they oppressed all other civilizations, not that they had a better system for civilization to begin with. This is what people mean when they say cultural Marxism. They're not referring to one-party dictatorship and planned economy. Though I'd say that it's unsustainable, cultural Marxist ideas could function in a neoliberal economy, and that might be where they actually thrive the most. These are usually the ideas used to justify things like mass immigration or affirmative action or feminism or stuff like that.
Maybe politicians and companies adapt political correctness to appeal to a broader voter and consumer base.
Exactly. This is what people are pissed off about. They're pissed off that their politicians are putting immigrants before the majority population so that they can import future voters, or that corporations are supporting mass migration to drive down wages and raise demand for consumer products. People are pissed off that their traditional culture is being forcibly replaced and that the establishment is using things like political correctness to shut down resistance.
And yes, I do acknowledge that college students tend to be more radical and some of the stuff they do is insane. But this has always been the case. A lot of people tend to get way too confident in their views while in college. Like for instance when a couple of feminist female students during one of Adorno's lectures, who was the head figure of the Frankfurt School, stood up, took off their clothes and started kissing Adorno as a form of protest against patriarchal structures, which produced this great photo. And while other men might have embraced this form of protest, old man Adorno didn't. He called the police on them and had them removed. This was in the late 60s, by the way.
Actually, no. Most students that are brainwashed into these ideologies don't become normal as soon as they leave. They might not dye their hair anymore or yell into a megaphone, but they go into things like journalism, HR, run for office, or they go back into education to educate more students, where they push the same ideology. Who do you think makes up the editing staff of Huffington Post or Salon.com? For example, James Damore was fired from Google for criticizing the company's diversity policy, even though what he said was factually correct. Do the people running Google really strike you as moderate people?
And now, at last, we're here at the last quote for the video. And if you didn't score any points up until now, this is your chance to make it all up. The doctrine of Marxism repudiates the aristocratic principle of nature and substitutes it for eternal privilege of force and energy, numerical mass and its dead weight. Thus it denies the individual worth of the human personality, impugns the teaching of nationhood and race have primary significance, and by doing this it takes away the very foundations of human existence and human civilization. If the Marxist teaching were to be accepted as the foundation of life in the universe, it would lead to the disappearance of all order that is conceivable to the human mind. And thus the adoption of such law would provoke chaos in the structure of the greatest organism that we know, with the result that the inhabitants of this planet Earth would disappear. Now, who might have wrote this? Is it from this book? Or this book? Or maybe from the manifesto of mass murderer Anders Breivik, since he also believed in cultural Marxism? Well, all very good guesses, but it's actually from this book, specifically from Chapter 2, Years of Study and Suffering in Vienna. And the only word I had to leave out to make it almost indistinguishable from what people like Stefan Molody want to make you believe is the biggest threat to the West right now is Jewish. It's nothing but Red Scare hysteria, then and now.
You don't like Marxism? Well, you know who else didn't like Marxism? Hitler.
And here's where we come full circle. The cultural Bolshevism conspiracy theory of the Nazis is inseparable to the cultural Marxism meme of today. These parallels are not incidental. Do you think that in any of Sargon's videos he shows the link between what he calls cultural Marxists and even a sentence by anyone of the Frankfurt School? Neither does Stefan Molyneux, Paul Joseph Watson or Aidan Paladin. They require you to accept it as a given that this is what's happening without demonstrating how this actually happens or making any specific references to the teachings of the Frankfurt School. They don't do it because there is none. And the only way you can subscribe to this is thinking, you know, the Nazis and Anders Breivik may have been mass-murdering psychopaths whose ideas completely ran against what Western values are, but that cultural Marxism thing, they had that figured out. Except it's not the Jews, of course, it's the globalists. Now, do I think people like Sargon or Stefan are raging anti-Semites who read Mein Kampf every day before going to bed? No, they simply bank on outrage and alarmism. According to Stefan, my country should have collapsed 5 or 6 times by now with the video "There will be no economic recovery" having aged especially well. But I'm sure the caliphate will be declared any second now.
Schon mehrfach vorgekommen, dass die von den Kindern ganz Protest aus angebildet werden, auf solche Sachen. Wie man das belegt, wenn es im Sommer ist, wenn die Mädchen etwas leichter bekleidet sind. Ist das irgendwie
ganz einfach, indem wir dort eine Provision dort nicht entlang fällt.
Sein eigenes Land, seine eigene Stadt darf man nicht mehr. Ah, Junge. In seine eigene Stadt. In seine eigene Stadt darf man nicht mehr gehen. Geh bloß nach Hause, Junge. Wer hat dich denn gewählt? Die kommen hierher und wir dürfen nicht mehr lang gehen. Junge, du haust Dinger raus hier.
Let me ask you this. Your country has experienced a spike in crime since the migrant crisis, especially violent crime and sexual crime. All large public gatherings now need armed security. Islamic enclaves are now forming in major cities. And the government's response to this seems to be getting Mark Zuckerberg to censor people from criticizing Germany's immigration policy on Facebook. And you know, at this rate, if high migration continues, according to Pew Research, in just over 30 years, Germany will be almost 20% Muslim. Can I ask you, do you really feel that the government of your country has the best interests for the native German population in mind? Because what it looks like is that they believe all cultures are better than their own, and that they owe it out of guilt to sacrifice their own future for that of a culture that seems completely incompatible. What would you call this idea? What phrase could you possibly use? I guess you could call it, dare I say, cultural Marxism.
On top of that, every one of these guys seems to believe it to a varying degree. Most of the people who talk about it on YouTube seem to have bought fully into it. Well, Armored Skeptic, for instance, mentioned that he thinks it's real to a certain degree in a live stream. With Paul Joseph Watson, I have no idea what he actually believes, since he's obviously just a con man. Cultural Marxism is nothing but a conspiracy theory rooted in anti-Semitism and propagated by people who fail to understand certain changes in culture they dislike.
Well, fair enough. This is a culture war after all. The culture has shifted pretty far to the left, but I'm in it to shift it back to the right. In conclusion, the Frankfurt School was not behind this Jewish conspiracy to bring about communism, but Marxist ideas are extremely prevalent in academia, which the Frankfurt School had strong influence on. These ideas have now left academia and are now propagated in the mainstream. They aren't being used to bring about communism, but they are being used to delegitimize any positive European identity. You never need to apologize for being proud of your culture, so don't fall for it. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter, link in the description. I will link all my sources down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.